Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Domenech. I'm the publisher of The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. I'm happy to be joined here today by the senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley, who has a new book, one which has been the subject of much consternation in the publishing world, which you might have heard about. It's about the tyranny of big tech, and we'll be discussing it over the next 45 minutes to an hour and taking questions from the audience. Josh, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with me today to talk about this book. So I look at this book with interest for a number of different reasons, but let's back up for a second and get a broader perspective about the relationship between the Republican Party and big business, of which a major factor in American business has obviously over the last several decades been big tech and the advancements we've seen there. Big tech has been viewed as being a very good thing for America. Americans enjoy the products that come from it. They enjoy the ability and the convenience of being able to order things and have them show up the next day, of free shipping, of access to streaming video, of all of these different things. Why are you a big tech critic, given that it seems so popular with the American people?
Well, I'm a critic because I'm a critic then of monopoly. And I think that what's happened is these tech companies have really achieved monopoly status. Achieved maybe even is the wrong word, because that makes it sound like it's something they've done on their own in partnership with the government. These companies, a handful of dominant platforms. We're talking here about Amazon, we're talking about Twitter, we're talking about Google, we're talking about Facebook, Apple. They've reached a status where they can suppress competition, where they can put up barriers to entry into the market, where they have, I think, are responsible for slowing down innovation, and also, of course, where they can exert political pressure and political power. And we see them doing that. And, that's actually not anything new in American history. What we've seen in the past, companies grow to monopoly status, we always see them try to project their power into politics. The railroads did this a century ago. We've seen other companies try it when they've really reached this massive status. And now these tech companies are trying to do it. And you talk about the things that we benefit from in tech, which we certainly do, but there's a lot that hurts us in tech as well. The theft of our data without any of our consent, the tracking of our kids online, the censorship, the addiction that these companies run on and try to push on us, all of those things, I think, are part of the tech monopoly.
I was curious how long it would take you in your book to mention Teddy Roosevelt. It took you 3 pages. Right. You obviously have written about him before. He was the subject of your study in the past. Teddy Roosevelt is somebody who was viewed by many, I think, conservative Republicans today as being someone who was basically a big government Republican, or a big government conservative, certainly in many respects, but also someone who was, very eager to use the levers of power against those different corporate entities that he saw as being bad for the country. Why should modern Republicans look back a century ago to someone like Teddy Roosevelt as being a model for what they do when it comes to these big tech companies?
It's a great question. I think that Roosevelt, we can learn for both good and bad from Roosevelt, because there's a lot of Roosevelt's legacy that is not to like. And I talk a little bit about that in this book. But I think what you really see with Roosevelt is somebody who understood the power that monopolies have and the danger that monopoly presents to democracy. This is a guy who believed that democracy was about the political power of working people, the political power of what he tended to call the common man and woman. And I think he was right about that. And he understood that monopoly is ultimately really a threat. It's a political threat even more than it is economically. It's bad economically, but it's even worse politically. And so he wanted to bust up the trusts in order to make sure that working people actually had control of their democracy. I think we can learn from that. I think as a conservative, myself in this era, we can learn from those principles of trust busting, which really are rooted all the way back in the American founding, about suspicion of concentrated power, suspicion of bigness. Roosevelt understood that.
Yes, and frankly, the founders, this is something that's underappreciated a little bit when it comes to their perspective on this, were people who were very cognizant of the dangers of this from their own experience in Great Britain and the like. There is, however, this whole question about the use of antitrust. You have your own proposal along these lines that has been criticized as being to the left of even what people like Amy Klobuchar have proposed. Tell me about the difference between the use of antitrust and the use of regulation, because a lot of the time the public conversation about these things merges when in reality, they seem to be quite different approaches to the problem that you're facing.
Yeah, they really are different approaches, I think. I mean, I would describe my views on antitrust as being about pro-competition. And I think that what we need to do is introduce more competition into the market. It's breaking up the concentrated power of these companies. You know, our founding fathers, just to go back for a second, Ben, to our history, the framers, and not just the framers individually themselves, but really a whole generations of Americans. I mean, really for the whole first century of our country's history, folks were very, very skeptical of concentrated power, not just in government, but also in the economy and in society. You know, that's why almost every state, in fact, every state, banned the corporate form. You couldn't even form a corporation in early America unless you were an educational institution or you got a special grant from the government to do a public works project. Otherwise, corporate form wasn't available. Why? Because they were so concerned it would concentrate wealth and power and set up a new aristocracy. I think we're kind of seeing a new aristocracy today. I think these tech companies and the people who run them, the amount of money, power, influence that they exert, I think our founders will look at that and say, "Ooh, you're flirting with danger there." I mean, there's a big, big danger.
Did you read this Wall Street Journal story from about 2 weeks ago concerning Amazon's relationship with this Canadian thermostat company?
I don't know that I did, but it sounds nefarious.
So well, it should be, because essentially the situation was this was a Canadian-based thermostat company, if I can thumbnail it, that had used Amazon's Alexa system as a way to have people be able to ask it to change the temperature. Amazon requested the ability to access data through their thermostat at all times, not just when you were talking to the thermostat. And when the thermostat company balked for privacy reasons and out of concerns related to that, Amazon said, well, fine, we'll delist you and we'll make a product that is exactly similar to yours.
There you go.
From my perspective, that's the point where my hackles are raised. This is not an entity that is behaving in a way that is necessarily, first off, it seems obviously unethical, but that also seems to run afoul of our basic laws that we already have in existence.
Right.
This to me is the sort of thing where the lines start to blur, and you say, for all the folks out there who say, well, it's not bad when a company does it versus the government.
Right.
How do you respond to a situation like that in a way that's responsible and that also doesn't violate conservative principles in favor of free market competition and the like?
You said something earlier about the difference between regulation and trust busting. I think there's a difference there. One approach to these trusts is to regulate the heck out of them. It's to say that, well, we're going to tell you what you can and cannot do when it comes to speech on your platforms. We're going to tell you what you can and cannot do when it comes to this or that aspect of your business model. That's one approach. The other approach, which I think, frankly, is more consonant both with our history and also with free market principles, is to say, we're going to break up your concentrated power that, by the way, you use the government to help you get. And so this kind of behavior that Amazon has, why can Amazon do what you just said, which, by the way, is not the first time they've tried something like this. And they're notorious for this. Amazon is notorious for this behavior.
It's a key element of their business model.
It is a key element of their business model. They pursue it, with fervor. And why are they able to do it? Because they're a monopoly, because they are the overwhelmingly dominant e-commerce platform. They also own a huge chunk of the cloud with AWS. They have their own product line, which you just referred to. What do they do with their product line? We know that part of the way they develop their own Amazon products is from taking information from the folks who are trying to sell products on Amazon.com. I mean, it's crazy. That's monopoly behavior. So how do we balance these things? My view is, we've got to prevent monopoly behavior. We've got to prevent anti-competitive conduct, and then we try to let the market work.
One of the things that you talk about in this book is the addictive power of big tech,
right?
Which again is not a bug, but a feature from their perspective. It's something that is inherent to their business model. You have been mocked for criticizing the ideas of infinite scroll, of automatically refresh, of video autoplay and the like. There is a balance, though, there between not wanting to have a nanny state government, but also not wanting to contribute to an environment in which our children, as Americans, are becoming addicted at a very young age in the same way they would to a lot of other things that we know, frankly, damage their mental development.
Yeah, I really think that the addiction aspect of this, the addiction model is what these companies are premised on, the social media platforms in particular. So what they try to do is that they try to get us to spend as much time as possible on their apps or online, on their platforms, whatever the particular mobile device is, but as much time as possible on their platforms. Then what do? They try to take as much of our personal information as possible so they can build huge dossiers about us individually, so that what? So they can then sell us stuff and sell access to us to third-party advertisers to try to direct very specific advertisements and other information toward us to change our behavior. That's the whole model. It is premised on addiction. It's premised on us spending inordinate amounts of time online, more and more and more and more, and our kids too, by the way, who they also track around. So my view is this: we've got to draw some lines here, and I think one of the ways that we draw the line, Ben, is that we say, if these companies engage in this kind of data tracking and what's called behavioral advertising, which is just where you build the dossier and then you use that to influence us, I don't think you ought to be getting subsidies from the federal government. I mean, why should you get the special immunity shield under federal law called Section 230 popularly? Why should you get that as a company with billions of dollars to them? Why should they get that subsidy if they're engaging in this kind of behavior? I think that that's a very reasonable place to start here, and to say, why would we subsidize?
So I don't want to get too much in the weeds, and we are going to be taking your questions soon, but on that Section 230 point, Justice Clarence Thomas, obviously no one that a conservative or a libertarian could ever say was not a conservative or libertarian when it comes to lots of issues, is someone who has clearly sent a message in multiple little ways over the last year and a half that he believes that this is something that ought to be reconsidered. Yes. He has said explicitly that he believes the protections put in place for big tech were written far before they achieved the kind of size and scale that they did, and that they are deserving of reconsideration by the court. In fact, in his most recent opinion on this subject, which was related to a case that was being dismissed over a lawsuit related to President Trump, he almost charted a path for the kind of way the court could approach this. I know that there are a lot of legal scholars who are reacting to this and who are concerned by it. My own impression is that Justice Thomas is approaching this very responsibly. He's reconsidering this issue. He thinks the court should reconsider this issue. Do you believe this is a situation where, even if your own proposals run up against the rocks, that the Supreme Court is ultimately going to step in and render a lot of these debates kind of moot? Say that the legislative branch of the federal government is going to have to readdress these things, or send a message back in order to reconsider a lot of the steps that have been taken over the past.
I think it's very possible, Ben. I think one of the most interesting things Justice Thomas has done this last year is an opinion in which he suggested that the courts need to own up to the fact that they have rewritten the key law in this area. It's the Communications Decency Act, and without getting too lawyerly on everybody, that's the law that basically allows big tech to be big tech. It's the law that says that big tech will be treated differently from any other company. They won't be treated like publishers. They won't be treated like a media company. You can't sue them. Most of the time, it's a huge shield. And what Justice Thomas pointed out is, courts have actually rewritten that law. Congress passed it back in the 90s before there was modern big tech, and then the courts took it, and at the behest of big tech, they rewrote it and they made it even more tech friendly. And Justice Thomas walks through how that happens. And I think what you see from him is saying, wait a minute, the courts made up a bunch of this stuff. Maybe we ought to revisit that. Yeah. That's not really what this statute says, and that'd be big.
And that, to me, is one of the reasons why, when people kind of dismiss the argument that you're making, or say that it's not something that will have enough truck within the Republican conference, I kind of say, well, the court is going to weigh in on this, and that's going to necessitate some kind of legislative reaction to either fix it or to go after a lot of these different things. One aspect of this that is in the news this week is the potential outsourcing of the surveillance efforts on the part of the Biden administration of what they describe as American extremists to big tech companies, saying to them essentially, look, we can't do this constitutionally as the government, but we'd like, as a favor to us, for you to do all these things for us. Now, personally, I find that terrifying. But to me, it's also one of these things where Americans have, over the years, become more and more used to just automatically clicking that permissions check mark, not reading any of the terms of conditions, etc., and ultimately, handing over enormous amounts of their data to these companies. So the libertarian argument would be, hey, you agreed to this. It's not our fault you didn't read the fine print, along the way in a lawyerly fashion. Whereas, from the Biden administration, this is an enormous opportunity for them to outsource a lot of things that we wouldn't naturally want the government to do, and which I'm sure the left would be raising high dudgeon about if it was happening under President Trump or President Bush or something like that. What do you think about that situation?
Dangerous, and all too real. And what you really see is the left discovering the power of monopoly. Then the left has really got comfortable with monopoly power, and this is one of the reasons why. It's because they can use these tech companies to do things that the government can't do under the First Amendment. Now, we are currently struggling with a scandal in how previous administrations, the Obama administration in particular, used our secret courts, used wiretaps, lied to courts in order to get wiretaps on the Trump campaign back in the 2016 election. That's bad enough. Now imagine just circumventing that whole process, which is really what the Biden administration is flirting with, toying with. They're saying, well, maybe we'll just ask these companies to go spy on Americans and then report back to us. And then we don't have to deal with the courts. We don't have to get wires. We don't have to get warrants, just none of that. You all go do it and then tell us what you found. That tells you what extraordinary power these companies have.
One more question on tech before I start taking some questions from the audience. I was reaching out to some of the moms who write for us at the Federalist for their own queries for you today, and one of them brought up the fact that as a parent, I appreciate when Hawley talks about the addictive nature of social media and what practices his family has put in place. So tell me about that. What have you personally done as a father to try to adjust the way that you use technology in ways that are both responsible, but that also allow your children to access the things that you want them to access?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, my wife and I have 3 little kids at home, 2 small boys who are 8 and 6 now, and then a newborn daughter. And, this has been a journey for us as a family. When our first boy was born, we initially gave him an iPad at a pretty early age because, we thought, well, there's lots of educational programming and that he can access and use. We thought he'd enjoy it, which he did enjoy it. That was part of the problem. And then we discovered that this iPad, from a very small age, he was really fixated on it and wouldn't go anywhere without it and had to have it all the time. We thought, well, that seems unhealthy. So we started digging a little deeper, and we started reading some of these studies about the effect of exposure to interactive devices and to social media on young children in particular. So now we've gone the opposite direction. Our kids don't have mobile devices. They don't have iPads, certainly not phones. They're not involved in social media at all. We allow them some screen time in a very limited fashion every week. And we do that to, you can learn stuff from the wider world, of course, and television can be a good thing. And social media can be a good thing, although I'd argue not probably at the age of my kids. So what we've done is we've set up a very limited amount of time where they can watch a show on television. They can interact with an educational program, but not on a mobile platform, not on an interactive device, and certainly not on social media. And I found, though, to be honest with you, Ben, one of the biggest problems in our household when it came to technology in the house was me, because I would come home from work and I'd have mobile phone in hand and I'd have my Apple Watch on, and it really dawned on me one day when I put my kids to bed and I was reading them a story, and I realized I had my phone in my hand and I'm reading the story and then I'm looking at my phone and I'm reading this and I'm thinking, why am I doing this? I mean, what's going on here? So my wife and I tried to set up our own boundaries where when we come home, I put the phone down, I take the watch off, I engage with my kids directly. I don't allow the device to become a mediator between me and reality. And I tell this story in the book. I think families have to reach their own practices here. You know what's best for you and for your family, for your children, spouse. But for us, finding that balance where, we allow the kids to access programming, it's going to be healthy, but we don't live our lives as a family on devices or social media, and that's been big for us.
Our 7-month-old is very aware when mom is looking at her phone as opposed to looking at her.
I can relate to that.
Aaron from Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you for representing true conservatives in the Senate from a fellow Missourian. Which do you find more frustrating to work with, very progressive liberals across the aisle or squishy Republican colleagues, and why?
Tough question. Well, listen, I would say that, first of all, thanks for the question. It's a great privilege to get to represent the state of Missouri, which I try to do to my darndest every single day. I will say that in this time in particular, I often say to my fellow Republicans that, this is a time where we've got to have the courage of our convictions. And if we don't like the direction this country is headed, and I don't like it, we've got to go out and make a case against it. We've got to have some courage. We've got to be able to go out and stand up and say, here's what we disagree with, and here's why. Here's why we think that monopoly power in conjunction with big government is bad. Here's why we think the government takeover of entire industries is bad. Here's why we think that outsourcing jobs to China and basically allowing the Chinese to run away with the competition in so many areas, which I think this administration is doing, is bad. And so I think, Ben, my answer would be that I do think as conservatives and Republicans, we need to have a little more courage in making that case to the public, because people are not going to. Oftentimes, I'll hear Republicans say, "Well, I think the public's really with us, but we'll find out later." Well, the public won't be with you unless you go out there and make a case and take a stand. Our progressive colleagues, I enjoy working with them. I try to find areas where we can partner together. I have partnered with across the aisle on big tech legislation in the past. But we just hold such fundamentally different worldviews that sometimes I just think that's
just to make this personal.
Yeah.
So if you had to assess, a politician like Bernie Sanders, someone who's been very heterodox, obviously has broken with the Democratic Party in the past and sort of neoliberals within it historically, but is also someone who brands himself as a socialist and has certainly pursued a leftist agenda. Is the issue there that basically he has the proper diagnosis of many of the problems in America, but the wrong proposed solution for them?
I think there's a lot to that. And Bernie and I worked together this past year on getting relief to working families. And I took, frankly, quite a lot of flack from that, from the establishment wing of my party. But listen, I've said over and over, I'll work with anybody on any issue that's good for Missouri. It's actually be good for what we believe in and good for working people in my state. I've really enjoyed working with Bernie on that, even though he and I disagree on close to everything. But I do think you made a really astute point, Ben, which is, this is a point I try to make in the book. I think our current political economy, if you like, the way that our politics and economy together are structured, is really unsustainable and is leading us to a path where we are endangering our democracy. And it's because it is siphoning away power and standing from everyday working people. That's really what this book is about. And I talk about tech's role in doing it. I kind of think Bernie would not disagree with that diagnosis. I can't speak for him, but you listen to Bernie, and I think he says, yeah, I get a lot of the problems. It's just his solution. His solution is full-on socialism. I think you talk about concentrated power. I mean, I think that goes in exactly the wrong direction, but I give him credit for being willing to call out the problems.
A question from Beth in Andover, Massachusetts. What can ordinary Americans do to support your and others' efforts to enact restrictions on big tech? As a conservative in a blue state, I have long looked for ways outside of my state to help enact change.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly think that being vocal about the change that you want to see, and whether that's contacting folks who represent you, who are your elected representatives, or contacting others and saying vocally there needs to be change. I also think that supporting the efforts, you've got now some folks in other states, in red states like Texas, for instance, like Florida. You really see people picking up the ball there in the state legislature, the governor's mansions, and saying, we're not just going to let tech get away with this. And if the federal government's not going to act, we're going to act. I did this as Attorney General of Missouri when I opened an antitrust investigation of Facebook and Google. And I think supporting those folks' efforts to do that, encouraging the people in those other states who are advancing this agenda, who are bringing lawsuits, who are saying we are not going to allow tech to censor conservatives while they allow the left to say whatever they want. I think getting behind them and encouraging them is really, really important. And then encouraging those of us in Congress who are fighting for this. I mean, here's what I've noticed, Ben, is that over the last 2 years, the view on tech issues on the Republican side of the aisle in the Senate, I think, has really changed. And I think that the reason it has changed, and that elected representatives, elected members have come to think that, maybe tech really is a problem, is because voters told them it was.
Yeah.
It's because they've heard from voters.
And to break away from the questions for a moment, one of the things that I remember you telling me, and this is, I believe, in it would have been in 2019, is you said that the big tech issue was becoming a kitchen table issue,
right,
in a way that national Republicans did not respect.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'd like you to explain what you mean by that, because I do believe that's true, but I'm not sure that that every Republican and certainly leadership Republicans necessarily understand that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The way I first got involved in the tech issue was, as I said a second ago, with my experience with my own kids, and then as the Attorney General of the state of Missouri was talking to other parents who were sharing terrifying stories about tech tracking their kids, about what they were seeing in schools with the tech handing out computers, and then all of a sudden, like, wait a minute, their personal information is being collected. The kids are being tracked on their mobile devices. So we started looking into this, and it really, what it told me was parents and working folks, they were alert and to what was going on with these tech companies, alert to their spying, alert to their censorship, and worried about it way before elected members of Congress or other elected officials were. And I think that is doubly true now. Although I will say this, if you can look at the last year of tech's behavior, with tech suppressing the Hunter Biden story back last November, directly interfering in the election in terms of trying to control news, and then in January deplatforming a sitting president and a slew of conservatives. If you can look at that and say, oh, we don't have a problem with big tech, probably nothing.
Obviously, the Facebook Oversight Board decision came down today. Right. There's a question here from Thomas, Hamilton, Ohio. With the recent ban of James O'Keefe from Twitter, big tech has shown they do not care about freedom of speech in the slightest. You can insert any other thing in there you want. They banned LifeSite News from Facebook today. They announced that they would re-up this ban of former President Trump on Facebook. What should conservatives do in response to this blatant disregard for the First Amendment? Now, I'm going to give the devil's advocate answer here, which is this is not a First Amendment issue. This is them finding that you violated their terms of service. Now, from my perspective, that is obviously an expression of Calvin ball, where the rules changed right on the moment. Right. But when it comes to pushing back against these types of things, people feel powerless. They feel like they like James O'Keefe. They want to hear from James O'Keefe. They like LifeSite News. They want to hear from LifeSite News. They like President Trump. They want to hear from President Trump. And yet these platforms say you can't do that. How can they vocalize their opinion in a way that's more effective than just screaming into the void? Yeah, they do feel powerless because they are powerless. And that's part of the problem, Ben. And so I think there's two things we can do. You make a point, first of all, about the First Amendment. It technically doesn't apply to these companies. That's right. Now, here's the thing, though. If we had real competition in this market, you and I and others might be able to go to a platform other than Facebook or a platform other than Twitter that actually respected speech and say, well, fine, if Twitter is going to censor, Facebook's going to censor, I'm going to go over here to this platform. We can't do that now precisely because they're monopolies. Point number one. Point number two, their own terms of service. Ben, I've had these executives. I had Mark Zuckerberg come and sit across the table from me like we are now. I've had them in front of me for hearings under oath, and they insist that they do not censor on the basis of political viewpoint. They insist on it, and they say it's in our terms of service. We don't do it. So here's what I would say. Make those terms of service enforceable. Allow Americans to sue. Just take the terms of service the companies have written that are currently not enforceable, make them enforceable. Let people sue. And so if you are deplatformed or you are censored or you think they've violated the terms, you can go have your day in court. When I've suggested this to the companies, they lose their minds. They say, oh my, no, it would ruin our whole business model. Well, that might tell you something. Tells you how enforceable those terms of service actually are. Charles from Savannah, you asked about Teddy Roosevelt. I think I asked that already. It's effectively Lisa from Little Elm, Texas. How is Congress working to stop big tech censorship of speech they don't like? Why are they given protection as publishers when they selectively publish and banish content they disagree with? The publisher conversation is an interesting one to me because as a publisher myself, it's literally my job title, I see the distinctions that are often made within that. And in fact, I have something from today, which you have not seen, but because it's happened in the last couple of hours, but I think is relevant to this discussion. We had one of our interns aggregated a 60-minute story concerning a Pentagon development where they had developed a technology to put into your bloodstream to monitor whether you've had COVID or other diseases or not. The content in the story is all pulled from this 60 minutes interview with Pentagon officials and from the Pentagon documents that are referenced by 60 Minutes. They censored that on Facebook. They said that the story lacked context. Okay, except they didn't censor the 60 Minutes post,
of course not.
from a month ago. That was exactly the same story that he's literally just rewriting because, oh, this is an interesting thing that the Pentagon did. Now, he's not claiming that you're getting injected with a microchip when you have a vaccine or anything crazy like that. He's just rewriting a 60 Minutes story because it makes for good content, and yet Facebook's outside fact checkers, which they obviously fund, come in and say, well, this story is missing context, and so therefore it cannot be shared. We see that happen time and again.
All the time.
And yet there is no real way to appeal against that. There's no process. It's a complete blank face. And really, if you are on the wrong political side, they're going to do what they want.
They're going to do what they want.
Is there a way to change that, short of going down the road of really having to essentially break them up? I mean, because people hear that antitrust argument, and I think that they have some sympathy for it, but they're like, but I don't really want the ability of my grandmother to share cat pictures to go away. I don't want to penalize my boomer friends for their expressing their opinions on this platform. They're worried that they will lose some of the good things that they have if you go down that road.
Yeah, I would say two things to that. I mean, the first thing, and the simplest answer to that is let people sue. And this is what I'm talking about, Ben. Give people the option to go to court to enforce those terms of service. Mm-hmm. Because once again, I mean, this happened to you today. I've had a Live Action, which is a pro-life group, a faith-based pro-life group that has been repeatedly censored by Facebook, repeatedly had their account locked, had their post throttled down. I think the same thing on Twitter. And they have said to me over and over, this has happened. Mark Zuckerberg, when he first came to see me, Ben, he admitted to me, he said, you know what, we made a mistake on Live Action. They supposedly fact-checked it. The fact-checker was a left-wing biased outfit. Facebook had to walk it back. What's Live Action to do about it? Nothing. You can't do anything about it. So I think giving people the right to go and enforce those terms of service is a big plus. The only other thing I'd say about breaking up the companies is that if we've got more competition, then it should result in more innovation, more services, and more choices, not fewer. So this is why you want to share cat pictures online. Great, go for it. If we have more competition, you probably have more chances to do that. But I think if you let the free market work, you'd see a lot more choice and innovation than we have now.
A couple more questions here, real quickly. From Rebecca in Centennial, Colorado. What is the hesitation of Congress to break up tech monopolies? It seems like Standard Oil was easier in its day. Is there too much financial interest involved?
There's a lot of financial interest involved. That's definitely true. I write about this in the book. The tech monopolies have invested enormous sums of money in buying lobbyists, influencing think tanks, influencing academics around Washington, D.C., and heck, the entire country. And they've had a lot of success doing that. So there is a lot of influence that has been purchased, and that's a big part of this. I also think that our friends on the left have really kind of fallen in love, as I said earlier, with monopoly power, because they've discovered, it's really useful. Facebook can censor so much more effectively than the government can. The government is constrained by the First Amendment. Facebook, not. Same thing with Google. Same thing with Twitter. So I think the left, they're increasingly soft on monopoly. They'll talk a good game about it, Ben. They'll say, oh, well, we got to get tough on monopoly. And then you put a proposal in front of them and say, okay, well, let's get down to the brass tacks here. Let's break up these companies. And they start to hem and haw and say, well, let's just regulate them a little more. Let's do that.
So two similar questions here from Michael in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and from Giancarlo in Orlando, Florida. They want to know about your favorite book other than the Bible and your favorite movie.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I think my favorite movie, it changes, but my favorite movie currently is The Darkest Hour, the Winston Churchill. So good. In fact, my wife was.
Oh, look, the politician likes a movie that's mostly about a politician.
So typical. My second favorite is Hoosiers, which goes all the way back to my boyhood.
Okay.
Yeah. But I was watching a piece of Darkest Hour again the other night, and my wife said, she's like, I think it rots your brain if you watch the same thing over and over and over. It's a sign of mental unhealth. So anyway,
that's bad for me in the Christmas Day speech, but keep going.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Also a good one. So that I think is probably my favorite movie. My favorite book, that other than the Bible, oh gosh, that is a really tough one. I'll tell you, interestingly, a book that's had, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's had a lot of influence on me over the years, and you can even see that influence a little bit here in this book. is there's a political theorist named Michael Sandel who wrote a book called Democracy's Discontent years ago, Ben, 20 plus years ago now, where he talks about republicanism with a lowercase r, and he talks about what role that played in our founding, and the basic views that, again, it gets back to the dignity of the common man and woman and the authority that they should have, really what I think our country is founded on. And that was really influential to me at an early age. Now, Sandel is a liberal. I'm probably, not doing him any favors by mentioning him now. He'll have to go and denounce me after this. And I don't know him personally at all. But I will say that I think his work is really interesting because it opened up for me, Ben, a different view on things. I had grown up as a conservative and a sort of libertarian conservative. And I still consider myself a libertarian in many ways. But Sandel's work really opened me to a different stream of American history that really emphasizes, again, the contributions of individuals, of working people in government, of everyday Americans, and the importance of being able to have some say in your government. The link between having liberty and having some control over your government, being able to share in self-government. And so that had a big influence on me.
Today, there's a report in the Wall Street Journal based on new evidence that we have from the census and from other government entities that essentially says that America is at the lowest birth rate since 1979. We have essentially decayed to a point where we are no longer in that replacement level. We're on the border of that when it comes to our foreseeable future. This is not the mark of a growing economy or a growing country. And the solutions that a lot of different people have put forward are basically about throwing money at the problem, which is a typical government, solution. The problem with that, of course, is that we actually don't see the evidence, or the evidence is very minuscule that makes any real difference in the choices of people to have kids. How can we change this as a social and cultural matter and not have it just be something where government is throwing more money at the problem and you're, effectively turning this into a situation where people are having kids in order to access money as opposed to having kids because they want to have kids, because they want to, because they're optimistic about the future, because they care about this in terms of the long-term benefit to the country. We see liberals like Matt Iglesias and the like writing books, in fact, trying to find ways to encourage people to have kids. What's the best way to go about this that isn't just another massive government program or redistribution of wealth?
It's a great question. I think we've got to reckon with some of the choices that we've made, bad choices that our policymakers have made over the last 30, 40 years that have put us in a situation where more and more working families in particular, working moms and dads, feel like both parents have to work all the time, both the individuals, I should say, not necessarily parents, need to work all the time in order to just make ends meet, and the children are not affordable, that raising a kid is way too expensive, and then there aren't the social support systems there to help with that. So I think two things: one economic, one social. On the social point, I think that we've seen a serious decline in face-to-face community, and more people say that the folks grandparents who used to live nearby, parents who used to live nearby, extended family, more and more people, that's no longer true. Those social support institutions like churches, for instance, synagogues, houses of worship, affinity groups, the associations like the Elks Club and the Lions Club and the PTA, those have less and less salience and relevance and strength in American life. That's a huge problem. I mean, that's a huge, huge problem. And I think as a culture, we've got to think about how do we repair those social ties? How do we repair the ties of community? How do we repair the ties of neighborhood? I think as we do that, we'll also help repair the ties of family. And people will feel like, well, I've got this social support I can have to have a family. The economic piece of it is this: we've got to be able to get people good paying jobs where they feel like they can start a family and then support a family. They don't have to move to some other place. Ben, the other piece of this is a lot of times people say, well, in order to get a good job, I got to move away from my social support network. I got to move away from my family. We need to get an economy where people say, hey, I can get a good job where I can support my family. I can do it in the place where I want to live, where my social support network is. And I've got some ideas on how to do it. I think we actually ought to let parents keep more of their tax dollars in order to address some of these economic challenges. And I've recently proposed legislation to do it. But you're right, it's a huge cultural and economic issue, and it's one that conservatives need to lead on.
there's a lot of concern among conservative circles and among, frankly, a broad swath of Americans when it comes to the idea of vaccine passports.
Right.
Something that is increasingly being discussed as a mandatory thing, either for your work, for your kids to go back to college, for potentially even your kids to go back to school. Or, I mean, frankly, the CDC proposals on summer camp seem quite, almost that.
Right.
What can conservatives do, and the particularly political leaders across the country do, to push back against this? We've seen a little bit of it from Ron DeSantis in Florida,
right?
But there don't seem to be a lot of people necessarily flocking to follow him in that.
Yeah.
What needs to be done, and how do you actually, express this in a way that it maintains, look, we still think you should get a vaccine, assuming that you don't have health concerns in other areas, but we shouldn't violate the relationship between the government and the citizen in a way that makes these things mandatory.
I completely agree with that. I think the idea that you would mandate that folks not only get the vaccine, but then share their vaccine status, if you like, in order to access this or that government service, or frankly, this or that corporate service, flying on airlines, et cetera, I think is really, really worrisome. I think we need to think about what we can do in the law to make sure that corporations don't abuse their power in this way, and certainly the government agencies don't start slipping in. The way this usually works, Ben, is a government agency will write a rule and they'll slip it in there, and it's it'll be an encouragement, it'll be a dear colleague letter. We strongly encourage you to have a vaccine requirement policy at your higher institution of higher learning, for example. We've got to be vigilant to make sure that doesn't happen, and that people are given the choice to make their health decisions. I mean, I always say, listen, do I encourage people to go get the vaccine? Sure, I do. But I also think Americans can make up their own minds. You give them the information, and then you give people access to the vaccines, and then you let them make a choice. And I think that's an important principle to stick to.
One more non-tech question before I have a final tech question. The issue of healthcare in America.
Yeah.
We obviously saw, under the Obama administration, an attempt to fix healthcare that didn't do what it promised to do. It promised to lower costs for Americans, give them a higher quality of care, cover more people, and essentially end uninsurance in America. It did none of those things. We have a Biden administration now, which is essentially just throwing more money at the problem and seeking to get more people signed up to these bankrupt Medicaid programs, which are strained to the max. Republicans have never been able to coalesce around a healthcare policy that is easily explainable and that they all seem to have buy-in on. America's healthcare system obviously has excellent outcomes when it comes to the treatment of people in almost every respect, but its costs are out of control. They are passed on frequently to people within private marketplaces in order to make up for the difference between the cost that is paid by the public. Is there any kind of effort within the Republican coalition right now to solve this healthcare problem in a way that would benefit working Americans and that would give them something to unite around, as opposed to just constantly playing defense?
It's a great question. If the question is the Republican caucus, or the group of Republicans in the Senate and the House working on something, the answer is, I think, not to my knowledge. Do I think there are ideas that we should use and a direction we should go? I think the answer is yes. And I think the Trump administration made some progress here when they allowed folks to begin to select other healthcare plans other than Obamacare or Obama approved private healthcare plans. So they loosened up the rules for healthy people to say, well, maybe I'd like to have a selection of different plans that have lesser amounts of coverage than Obamacare required, but I can choose that if I'm healthy. I think the key thing, what we have to balance and do is we have to make sure for folks who have pre-existing conditions that they are able to access quality health care at a price that is affordable and that is, in fact, I believe, no higher than folks who don't have pre-existing conditions. That there's a role there for the government to play, because that's an insurance problem. Those folks, because of the pre-existing condition, are very expensive to insure. Some states have done this where they've had really great success, where they focus on that population of folks and then focus on making sure their insurance is available, that it's affordable, that you keep the prices low, and then you allow other folks to have a selection of plans that is right for them and their family. So I think there are things that we can build on here in doing this. And approaches we can build on, but I share your frustration. I think that's a fair word to say, with the lack of Republican vision on this in the past. And I think, listen, what people want is they want to be able to make their own healthcare decisions, and they also want to make sure that the insurance that they paid for is available to cover
Yes.
their needs.
I want to thank you all for tuning in. You can access more copies of this book at premiercollectibles.com/tyranny. I do have one final question with you about this book. Obviously, it achieved a lot of attention for the fact that you were canceled.
Yeah, right.
In this book, which, I mean, I don't see anything in this book that would merit cancellation. I'm sorry to tell you that you need to be a little more edgy.
That's right.
But we're here in Regnery, which has dealt with this repeatedly on a number of different respects. We see the increasing efforts at Amazon in particular against socially conservative writers writing about trans issues. Ryan Anderson, obviously, Abigail Shrier,
Right.
and the like. This is not going to be an issue that goes away. Are you anticipating that there is going to be any kind of opportunity to push back against what really is, an utter violation of the old guard liberal approach when it comes to effectively book burning?
Yeah. I think what you just said, Ben, is so important. What these companies, a lot of these corporate publishers have tried to do is the modern day equivalent of book burning. It's digital book burning, where you try and silence views you don't agree with, and then you just don't make the book available.
Yeah.
And you mentioned some authors this has happened to, where they can't, they have certain outlets, whether it's e-commerce outlets or whether it's chains, major chains, who say, I won't carry that book. I won't allow you to sell it on my platform. And if they band together to do it, the book essentially becomes unavailable. I think that we've got to call this out and just say, listen, where is that civil libertarian tradition in America that says that if you don't like the speech, you can go out there and say, boy, I disagree with that. Here's why I think it's wrong. But we don't silence speech that we disagree with just because we disagree with it. The whole cancel culture that the left has really embraced, where they now want to turn the entire nation into a leftist safe space, where if they're offended at all, they're going to shut you down. It's dangerous, not just to the First Amendment, it's dangerous to our democracy.
The book is The Tyranny of Big Tech. The author is Senator Josh Hawley. I'm Ben Domenech. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in and join us today for this virtual sign.